Which Side Podcast is a proud member of the Which Side Media Collective.
This week's episode is brought to us by the Which Side Collective store. Patches. You know you want them. So we're going to offer them to you for 99 cents. Just use promo code SNOWGODS or SNOWMASTERS. That's SNOWGODS or SNOWMASTERS. I got it. Get it? I get it. I get it. Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. 99-cent patches. Snow Gods, Snow Masters. And that will be all January long. That's an unlimited amount of patches. You know? As many as you want. You have some holy pants? Get a patch. You have a holy hoodie? Yeah, get a patch. Get it. WhичSideCollective.org. This is episode 165. Yeah, we talk with Zach Groff. He's an organizer with Direct Action Everywhere, and he also works with Innovations for Poverty Action. It's a really fun conversation, so make sure you stick around for the whole thing. Hey Jordan, what news and events do we have going on? Well, if you are in Salt Lake City on January 12th, there is a rally against Donald Trump. It's called Dump Trump. It's basically to fight against his racism and Islamophobia. There is also... because seriously, fuck him. Yeah. I mean, fuck all the candidates. Don't get me wrong, but fuck him. Especially fuck him, for sure. If you're in New York, January 15th through 17th, there is a No New Animal Lab event. Storm Skanska, Swarm New York. So check it out. There's no listener shout out this week. If you'd like to do a shout out, all we ask is you just go to whichsidepodcast.com, click on the donate tab. You can record a shout out on the website and we will play it on the air, or we can read a shout out that you write. We will be your shills. Just go to whichsidepodcast.com, click on the donate tab. For the slingshot this week, January 7th, 1919, 46 IWW members, or commonly known as the Wobblies, were found guilty on conspiracy charges in Sacramento, California. I'm sure they had a fair trial. Of course. Yeah. I saw a Wobbly sticker on a hard hat the other day. Stopped the gentleman, wanted to say, I like your sticker. He was a little taken aback. He was like, oh, thanks. I saw somebody had Joe Hill on their bike or something, and I said, Joe Hill, woo! Woo! And they just looked at me really weird. Is that Go Joe Hill, or I'm glad they killed him? Well, if I know who Joe Hill is, I'm pretty sure that I'm a supporter, because that was 100 years ago. Touche. If you like these little tidbits of history, I Paul Amel, the Slingshot Personal Organizer. Get one. Get organized for 2016. And do that by going to a local info shop or an online info shop like AK Press. I sincerely hope this episode is enjoyed by you.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side? Which side are you on? 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 Which side are you on?
So what have you been up to this weekend?
Well, it's been a lot of activism. Activism is basically my second day job. So tonight I've been getting ready to re-record a talk I gave at the National Animal Rights Conference this year in August about behavioral science. I'm a student of behavioral economics and lessons from that for the animal rights movement.
That super fascinates myself. I have like a very small understanding of behavioral economics. Mainly, my only introduction was through Freakonomics and their podcast.
Yeah, it's similar to that sort of thing. Basically, it's a lot like the book Nudge, if you've heard of that book. About so these sort of little tweaks you can make to choices so that people make choices that are perhaps a little bit better informed, a little bit more rational in some ways. And so where I work, we use these tools to address global poverty. And so I'm familiar with some of the literature on human behavior. And I think a lot of the stuff that economists and psychologists have found isn't really taken all that seriously in the animal rights movement. So I think there's a tendency for many people to think that winning the case for animal rights is a matter of persuading people and giving people exactly the right argument to persuade them. But a lot of times, even if someone accepts an argument, they're not going to act on it, or they're not going to admit it, or they're not even going to be willing to accept an argument for reasons that don't have to do with whether it makes sense or not. It's a matter of social pressure. You know, we live in a world where violence against animals is the norm, and so even if someone hears a totally ironclad argument, it's hard to accept it if it's going to put you at odds with your friends. And you know, our thinking and our thought processes are profoundly influenced by other people. Also, we're influenced not just by what we know, but by what is on the top of our mind and what sort of is grabbing our attention, because we only have so much attention to go around. So if factory farms and the things that most Americans already know about are at the back of our minds, we're not going to do anything about it. And so one of the jobs of activists is not only to persuade people, but to make these things salient to them, to make them things that really capture their attention.
So viewing it from that aspect, how do you not just persuade them that this is the right thing to do, but then also alleviate those other social pressures that you were talking about? How, as activists, can we do that?
So at Direct Action Everywhere, we have a few things we do. With the social pressure thing, there are several different levels to this. One is social pressure makes it difficult for us to be activists and for us to sustain our commitment of activists, to sort of take on the pressure of doing something that your friends and family don't approve of. So, I mean, I've been doing some forms of activism around various issues for a long time, but before animal rights activism, they were all things that were basically accepted by most people around me, whether it was like the Save Darfur movement, work on global poverty. These are things people around me can agree are good things to agitate around. But with animal rights, you're at odds with your friends and family. And so one of our big goals is to build a community where we can sustain each other. And so we have chapters all across the country. We have meetups at least once a month, in some chapters once a week, where we come together. Have food, we have discussion, we have camaraderie. And we have another program called DXE Connections, where each month we have people within chapters who are paired with others to meet up and to connect. And that's supposed to build these one-on-one bonds so that we're all tighter and we feel supported. So, you know, I have some sort of a difficult conversation with my parents. We're all used to these really hard arguments we get into, often beyond our own will, with other people around animal rights, around veganism. And this way we have someone to go to and someone to support us. So that's sort of how we counteract social pressures and also create positive social pressures for activists. Then we also want to do a sort of an outward-facing thing to create a counter pressure to the wider societal pressure. And there are a number of ways we do this. One is our protest work, I think, has a big role in creating a counter pressure to the wider social pressure. And I think this is what you see over the course of history, you see dominant views that start to fall when you have sustained movements of nonviolent direct action. So, in the civil rights movement, when you had 100,000 people march on Washington, that sends a very clear signal that there is this really strong and energetic constituency that is demanding change. And that can create a powerful pressure to counter the pressure for things to stay the same. So there's a phenomenon in psychology known as the system justification hypothesis, which is that basically we're all inclined to justify the systems we're part of. And it sort of makes sense because it's kind of hard to go through life constantly questioning everything. It's we're evolved to sort of assume things are okay. And that a lot of that has to do with social pressure. A lot of it has to do with the influence of those around us. And so when you see a protest, when you see this sort of thing, it disrupts that. And it sends a signal that, wow, not everyone around me agrees that violence against animals is okay. Not everyone around me agrees that it's acceptable to exploit animals for food. And I think right now our chapters are mostly at a very sort of beginning stage where chapters have anywhere from 5 to maybe 30 people who come out once a month for a day of action where we go inside a restaurant, a store, or other place of violence against animals and have an in-store demonstration. But this is rapidly growing, and we've now started doing quarterly convergences where all the chapters in a certain region will come to the same city. So I'm in Connecticut, and all of our Northeast chapters gathered in New York City. And when you have these sorts of things, you have 50, 100, 150 people, just looking at the way people see the protest, you can see in their eyes that something very different is going on. So when 50 or 100 people go inside Whole Foods, chanting, demanding, with speak-outs, demanding change, it ceases being, oh, why are these people screaming? And suddenly you see people looking at you and they're asking, why is everyone so upset? What is wrong? And it sends a really clear signal that something is wrong, that all is not right in the land. And so I think these protests create that social pressure. And any sort of large event that seizes public attention. So another example would be investigations into agricultural facilities. Any of these things that sort of capture this public attention and force attention to this issue start shifting that social pressure so that there are positive pressures, and so that pressure to conform and to be part of this violent system starts being weakened.
Weren't you a part of an investigation into, was it turkey, a Thanksgiving turkey slaughterhouse?
Yeah, so I was one of the investigators as part of an open investigation into Diestel Family Turkey Ranch, which is one of only 3 suppliers to have gotten the highest rating in the Global Animal Partnership, which is basically the animal welfare standards used and established by Whole Foods Market. So the Global Animal Partnership has 5 steps, and at each step it's progressively stricter. And then beyond step 5, they have what's called 5+, which is farms that meet an exceptional quality where, according to the standards, the animals, the care for the animals takes an animal-centered approach. Animals live their whole lives on one farm, and it's a very idyllic image. And so Whole Foods has been advertising Diestel with these beautiful images, a sign that says "Happy Turkeys Ahead." You see these turkeys with all of their feathers strutting around in sunlight and grassy fields. Well, it turns out that all of this video and all of these photos come from a farm that, according to water records, ceased all commercial operation in 2012. So they have, I think, a few hundred turkeys there. And in fact, there's a much bigger facility where the turkeys are coming from that is not at all like that. And this facility is basically your classic industrial farm. So when I went there and I arrived at the facility, from one side from one side of the row of sheds, I could not see the end of the row of sheds. I mean, it was that big. You open up the shed door and it's cavernous. I mean, you almost can't see the end of a shed from the door. So it's a really massive facility, and you really when you go there, you do not get any sort of idyllic image. The night I was there was actually a truck loading up for the slaughterhouse. And so as I approached the facility, I could hear the sounds of probably at least 10,000 turkeys basically screaming for their lives, and really loud machinery that I think they must have been using to load them up into the truck. And it was the most eerie thing, because we got out of the car and we walked to the facility, and the shed where they were loading up for the slaughterhouse truck was a bit far away. And we sort of passed it on the way to the sheds that we went to. And when we were on our way back to the car, when we passed the shed where they were loading up the truck, you could hear basically no one. The turkeys were all silent because they'd all been stuffed inside this truck, subdued. And I mean, it was that silence was deafening, and I can still hear those screams to this day.
Was that like the hardest part about being there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the memory that sticks with me, is really the sounds. If you've ever heard a turkey cluck, it's basically like that, but extremely high-pitched, and you can really hear the desperation in their voices. I mean, you can hear them. I think they sort of know what's happening when they're getting scooped up by the dozens and thrown into this truck.
So what was the outcome of this investigation?
So the outcome was we released the investigation, and we got pretty major media coverage. It was in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. There was a lot of interest in the story, as well as a protest at the second largest football game of the year, which is the Detroit Lions game on Thanksgiving, sometimes called the Turkey Bowl. So 4 of our activists actually ran onto the field at the end of the game with banners saying "Animal Liberation Now, it's not food, it's violence," and images from the investigation. So that got even more coverage than it would have before. And it also sparked a series of protests. We had a number of protests last month with coverage all across the country. My chapter was covered by the biggest newspaper in Connecticut. I know the Bay Area chapter was covered by several television outlets. And so it's really forced quite a bit of attention to the issue and put Whole Foods in the spotlight. They were actually on the Wall Street Journal's risk list, which is a list of the sort of the stocks to watch out for and the companies you don't want to be investing in at the moment. And so our goal with this is not to give the sense that Whole Foods is somehow out of step with the industry. Our goal is really to show that this is a systemic problem, and that Whole Foods is really symbolic of the fraudulent, humane image many people have of the meat they purchase, and the inherent violence of this entire industry. And I think the investigation really got to that, because Whole Foods, in their response, basically created a conversation around whether this industry is acceptable at all. And the articles about it, many of the articles about it, actually put the question on the table of why is it acceptable to kill and hold in captivity turkeys when we know that's not acceptable for dogs and cats. And I think that's really the conversation we need to start having, and this really got that on the table.
So how is Whole Foods responding to this?
Well, so Whole Foods is responding in a number of ways, all of which are fairly ridiculous. One of the things they're trying to say is they're not sure if it's the right farm, it's not representative. We have photos with GPS metadata confirming exactly where they came from. So unless the farm was sort of magically transported somewhere between when we investigated and when the investigation came out, our video and images definitely come from the farm. And we have all sorts of documentation on the walls of the farm with the image of the Global Animal Partnership, which is Whole Foods Animal Welfare Rating System. So we have quite a bit of documentation that this is the farm. Whole Foods also, I think in their response, really sort of doubled down on the ridiculous claims they make with their auditing system. So they have a system where farms are audited once every 15 months. And the Global Animal Partnership, which manages the auditing and manages their ratings, has really a handful of employees who are paid a total of under $100,000. So it's sort of like if Barack Obama was governing the entire United States, because you're talking about 300 million animals who they're auditing. And so when we released the investigation, they said we went to the farm and the conditions were not as they were depicted in the investigation. And, it's a pretty ridiculous claim because obviously, A, the farm knew the investigation was happening, and B, you can't go to a farm every 15 months and say you've seen what's going on. Our investigators went there repeatedly, probably at least a dozen times over the course of 9 months, and really have a pretty clear sense of what's going on at the farm. And I mean, when you get down to it, when you have as many birds as they have, they have dozens and dozens of sheds, and you have probably at least 10,000 birds in each shed. There's no way to do that humanely. There's no way to do that and have the birds be well off. So that's a pretty ridiculous claim. And then the last thing they've said is that our goal is to end animal agriculture, as if this is some sort of indictment of the investigation. And it's kind of funny because, as I was saying earlier, this is the conversation we want to have. We want to have a national conversation around this industry. People, I think, in the United States and in many other developed countries know something about factory farms, and they have this sort of spooky image of factory farms. And so the response to that has been to market certain farms as being different, as being special. And our investigation really showed that this is not the case, and that these farms, that there is an inherent violence to this industry, and that these supposedly good farms are not good. And so Whole Foods really is opening up the conversation we want to be having about whether you can have this industry without having the violence. And I think as more and more of these investigations come out, it's going to become pretty clear that the answer is no.
With the amount of animals that come out of this specific industry you're talking about compared to the larger animal agricultural system, do you feel that making the change of, yes, we acknowledge that this one system is bad, will really make a greater difference towards the traditional, mass agricultural farming system, which is still the vast majority of all animals?
I think it would create a change because, so to quote a critical theorist and philosopher named John Simbamatsu, the humane meat is sort of the wobbly linchpin that is holding up the entire system of meat. So, I think all of us who are in this movement, or even who are vegan, we talk to people, one of the most common responses is, well, I try to buy meat that's humane, or I try to buy meat that's ethical, or cage-free, which is itself ridiculous because birds raised for meat are not kept in cages. But people use this as sort of a way to justify it. And then beyond that, even people who don't say that they personally purchase humane meat, it offers sort of a palliative to the conscience. When I've spoken to family members about this issue, they'll often say, well, would you be okay if it were done in a certain way? You'd be okay if animals were slaughtered in a way that was painless, and they'll go on. if I were to say, yeah, I would be okay if it were done in that way, people take that as a license to do it, to raise animals whatever way you want to raise them, because there's something about the way we think about things morally, where we think with taboos and we think in terms of wrong or right. And so when we've opened up the possibility that this might be done okay, people think, well, we need to reform it, we need to tweak it, but it's okay to keep it going. And we need to send the signal that when we don't care about their deaths, we're never going to care about their lives. And so this is a system where we are raising animals to kill them, and no matter how we do it, it's going to end up violent. So I think if we start to question and have a conversation around the supposedly humane industry and the fraudulent and violent nature of the supposedly humane industry, it's going to trigger a lot of changes around the system as a whole.
I'm super interested in the work you're doing around poverty. Is that something that you can go into now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I work at a nonprofit called Innovations for Poverty Action. Basically, it's a group that was founded in the early 2000s, related to a research lab at MIT called the Jameel Poverty Action Lab. And what we do is we use what are called randomized controlled trials to study global poverty. So a randomized controlled trial is basically like what they do in medicine, where when you have a drug that is going to be released to the general public, before you can release it, you need to have a study where you randomly distribute either the drug or a placebo to a pool of people. And so whether someone received the drug or a placebo is completely random. And what that means is that when you look at the difference between those who got it and those who did not, all of the differences between those two groups should be caused by the drug. And so you can identify fairly precisely and accurately what the effect of the drug is. So we basically do the same thing with various measures that governments, NGOs, and other agencies are taking to address global poverty. So an example would be microfinance. Since the 1980s, there's been this great push by many charities to provide these small loans to people in poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, in South Asia, so that people can use those loans, whether it's for business or personal consumption. And the finding was that people would actually repay these loans. And there's been all this hype that they have this really dramatic effect. And so we did actually a series of 6 studies into these microloans where we basically found that they were pretty good. They were good things for people to have, but they didn't have this sort of dramatic, life-changing effect that they'd been hailed as having. Some examples where we did find dramatic effects are, there's a classic study now into what's called school-based deworming. So in many sub-Saharan African countries, children are often absent from school because they have intestinal worms. And these intestinal worms make them too sick to go to school. This is actually, I believe, the largest cause of absence from school in most sub-Saharan African countries. And so there was a randomized trial where certain students at certain schools were randomly given these pills. And so you could see the differences between those who got the pills and those who didn't. And this one was actually a little bit more sophisticated because there were some schools where no one got the pills, and there were some schools where some children did and some didn't. And so you could even see the differences between those children who were at schools with other kids who got pills but did not themselves get pills, and those who were at a completely untreated school. And you could see that there were spillover effects where just going to school with someone who is getting these pills benefits you quite a bit relative to not having your classmates on this medication.
So what got you involved in this line of work?
I think I've always sort of had a drive to, I guess, sort of question the arrangement of things and to have compassion for individuals who are very different from me. And I think that sort of ties both of these projects I work on. I've also always had an interest in just sort of using academic tools to address pressing issues. So when I was a sophomore in college, I got an invitation to a talk by this professor who's now my boss named Dean Carlin, and he is a behavioral economist who founded this organization where I work. And he basically gave this talk about how using an analogy by the philosopher Peter Singer, where basically Peter Singer talks about this story where you're on your way to a meeting and you pass this pond where you see a child who's drowning. And he says, most of us would readily agree that we have an obligation to go into that pond and save that child. And Singer basically uses this story to argue that we have an obligation to do whatever we can to help children in developing countries who are starving and dying from poverty. And that for individuals in Western countries, we have the ability to save lives. And if we don't do that, we're sort of failing a moral duty. And what Dean Carlin, my boss, said was, in addition to having a moral duty to help, we also have a moral duty to figure out the most effective way to help. Because if supposedly by the pond, there are two ways to help the child. I can say, I can wade into the pond, or I can maybe throw a plank of wood the child can latch onto. One of those might work a lot better than the other. And it could be that knowing which one works is going to determine whether the child lives. It could be that if I throw the wood, I won't succeed, but if I wade in, I will. And so that knowledge is really crucial. And he used this to argue for what we do in studying these poverty alleviation tools, because he argued that knowing how we can actually help people who are suffering in poverty is just as crucial as actually giving money and working to end poverty.
How does your work take your animal rights activism?
In terms of how do people at work take it?
Yeah, yeah. Like, what's like the response towards it?
I think people are probably fairly understanding. I believe I'm the only vegan in the office. There are a number of vegetarians, and certainly everyone in the office is well aware of the issue, having me as a coworker. I think there is a higher level of sort of understanding and recognition of the issue, because there are increasing ways in which these two camps are sort of intersecting. So there's a movement, I don't know if you're familiar or if your listeners are familiar with, there's a movement called effective altruism. Mm-hmm. It has a lot to do with sort of the story I was telling about the child drowning in the pond. And it's people who are very motivated by this idea that we want to do the most good. And a lot of people in this movement, especially when it started out, were focused on global poverty, just because of how many people are suffering in such horrific ways. And increasingly, there are a lot of people in this movement who are engaged in the question of animal advocacy, because you have, in the U.S. alone, you have 50 billion animals every year being killed for human consumption. So that's 10 billion land animals and 40 billion sea animals. And so obviously the numbers are much greater globally, going through really quite horrific things. And so you have a lot of people who have both these interests that I think lead to a lot of interesting intersections. I'll say I'm sure my activism does not increase my popularity, but I think as activists in a movement that is really starting out, it's basically our job to put that on the line and to be unpopular, and we have to make the stand we need to take. And I think people at work do respect that authenticity and do respect my willingness and ability to stand by, by my beliefs in what's right and what's just.
How do you feel that poverty relates to food deserts and like animal agriculture?
So this is actually an issue that I'm surprisingly not that well versed in. I think food deserts are sort of an issue more in developed countries, with domestic poverty in the United States and in European countries. For people in developing countries, it's aside from major metropolises, hunger is pretty widespread. My understanding is that animal agriculture, though, does have a pretty devastating role in global poverty in all sorts of ways. It basically, eating animals is just terrible from a distributional perspective. You have this massive amount of plant and grains that have to be fed to animals that then can't be fed to human beings. And, in the United States, our government does basically everything it can to prop up industry in ways that can also hurt developing countries. So we have these massive agricultural subsidies that cripple other industries in developing countries. So I think they're pretty significant distributional effects globally. Domestically, I'm not that well versed in it, but I have a number of friends who are working on this issue. In particular, an activist by the name of Brenda Sanders in Baltimore. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she runs a group called PEP Foods, and basically she's working in inner city Baltimore, in actually some of the neighborhoods where the Baltimore uprising occurred. So when I went and visited her community garden, it was right near the CVS that was burnt, and she's working to build community gardens to educate people where she lives and to create this low-income vegan food business that's community-run. So I think there's a lot of very inspiring work being done around the intersections of animal agriculture and domestic poverty.
What's your origin to veganism in general? What really brought you towards veganism and kind of radicalized you?
So I think I always sort of thought there was something weird about eating animals. When I was little, I just remember thinking, oh, this is, they had to kill this cow for us to eat this. And I thought it was strange, but everyone around me did it. And I think this happens to everyone, but for me, it happened at probably a much more conscious level. I just concluded, if everyone's doing this, there must be some reason why it's okay. And as I got into high school, I sort of continued having that justification. By that time, actually, when I was pretty little, one of my sisters, I have two sisters, and the younger one of them became vegetarian in college. And so that sort of idea was there for me. But in high school, I got pretty hooked on my high school's philosophy club, which sort of tells you how nerdy my high school was. But I started going every week to this philosophy club. And one week we read an excerpt from The Lives of Animals, which is a book by a South African author named J.M. Coetzee. And in this book, there's a woman named Elizabeth Costello who basically goes off the rails and just starts saying whatever comes to mind and just starts expressing all of her sort of moral grievances without any qualms. And she really is fascinated by animal agriculture and by our mass slaughter of animals. And so she has this quote where she says, people say, I'm not going to have it exactly, but something along the lines of, we talk about the Nazi Holocaust and we talk about how the Jews were led like sheep to the slaughter. And she says, why is it okay to lead sheep to the slaughter? And so I'm Jewish. My great-grandfather's whole family was killed, most likely in Auschwitz. And so the Holocaust is something that's very close to my heart. And especially in high school, I was involved in a lot of Jewish activity and very concerned with that. And I took a lot of offense often when people made comparisons to the Holocaust that were usually pretty trivial. But when I read this, I couldn't help but think, wow, this makes a lot of sense. And I remember saying, like, I was eating animals. I was completely supporting this industry at the time. But I remember saying, this makes sense. And there's not much we can say to this. But I still sort of concluded there must be some reason this is okay. And I went on thinking I would probably be vegetarian in college. And freshman year came and I was taking an ethics class with a professor named Shelley Kagan. And he made some very brief comment in the class where he was talking about various moral theories. And he said, you know, we generally don't think it's okay to hurt people. And, you know, by the way, you probably feel the same way about animals. You know, if I had a cat in this class and I decided to torture the cat, you would all object to that. And that suggests we should be vegetarian. And I think that day I stopped eating meat. And then I didn't get the reasons for veganism. I didn't see what was wrong until I read Animal Liberation. And then when I read Animal Liberation and I read those descriptions, I stopped eating eggs and dairy. But I was not an activist. I went, I guess, about 4 years before I became an activist. It's kind of funny. I always sort of felt like we're obligated to do something when we're faced with an injustice and that we're obligated to speak out. But somehow I had a divide between that and being vegan. I sort of kept to myself. And if people asked me, I would talk about what happens to animals. But generally, I wouldn't go out of my way. And I had a friend in college who was sort of known as the angry vegan. We all, this is such a label. He was sort of known as the angry vegan. And he would sort of ask me to come do activism with him, which generally consisted of leafleting or food sampling. So it's kind of funny because the activities he did were really not angry activities. They were, here, smile, take a leaflet and, have some food. But he's known as the angry vegan. And he would beg me to come join him. And every so often I would, but I very rarely would I do that. And then when I started getting involved in the effective altruism community and seeing, and really just joining a community of people who had the same idea that I had, that when we're faced with an injustice, we're obligated to do something. And that, our privilege, my privilege being born in the United States as a white, able-bodied male, that I have to use that privilege for good. I started thinking, well, I think I'm obligated to take action. But all of the things that people were doing seemed like they were not really what we needed. It just didn't seem like leafleting was what was going to do the trick. It's kind of funny. A friend made a comment to me once that no movement has ever risen on the back of leafleters. And I think he thought he would sort of talk me out of being an activist. But what actually happened was I escalated quite a bit more. And I think a few days later, I came across this video of Priya, who was one of the core organizers of Direct Action Everywhere. And it was a video of her doing what we called the Disrupt Speciesism Challenge, where we encouraged activists to go into restaurants and hold up a sign and just ask people for a moment of their attention to talk about the violence that happened to animals that could end up on plates. And I saw this and I just thought, this is what our movement needs. really puts the issue on a table. It forces a conversation. I just thought the optics were interesting. It really dramatizes the issue, and you see these people who, you see the anger and you see the moral outrage in a way that you don't with the sort of nicer activism. And I think that moral outrage is an important signal to send. This is an important issue. And so I commented on the video, does anyone want to organize something in New Haven, Connecticut? Of course, New Haven, Connecticut is not the best place for an activist. It's, there aren't that many people. But some Direct Action Everywhere organizers responded to me and said, yeah, we'd love to help you organize. And next thing I knew, I was in an email conversation with them. It's kind of funny looking back on it a year ago because I seem like a totally different person. I mean, I said, okay, I made an event, but I kept it private because I don't want anyone to know that I'm doing this. And I don't have any friends really who are vegan. I just had no idea what I was doing. I was scared. I was shy. And next thing I knew, there were 10 people who I was leading into a restaurant for a protest, trying to pretend I wasn't scared shitless. And we had a second protest the month after that. And then in January, we came out with the first investigation that the Direct Action Everywhere Network has done into an egg supplier to Whole Foods. And when that came out, we had protests every week, and I started calling press when I sent out press releases, and we got quite a bit of press in New Haven. It was actually pretty favorable press. And I just got hooked, and that minute by minute engagement where there were constantly things going on in January, it just felt really exciting. Like we were really doing something. We were really getting this message out there. We were on, I think, Fox Connecticut, which has probably at least a few 100,000 people who watch it. Aired one of our protests, and just getting that message out there to all these people really felt very powerful and very inspiring to me. And so more and more I got engaged in this work. I went out to California and participated in the forum, which is where all of our activists gather together. And that was one of the most powerful weekends of my life. And I came back from that thinking I wanted to really make this my principal commitment in life, and to really do whatever I could to ensure this movement wins. So yeah, I mean, that's what happened. It is amazing looking at this email from just a year ago, because I'm a totally different person. I mean, I'm so much more confident now and so much more willing to talk about this issue. And also, frankly, being involved in activism, I think, has actually made me a much less angry vegan. I think because I express this moral outrage and I have a community of people who support me, I can deal with this issue and talk about it with people in a much better way. And so with my family, for instance, I think I would have gotten much more aggravated about things that now sort of just roll over, and I can give the right response now in a way that paints me as sort of a nonviolent, confident, nonviolent defender of animals in a way that I couldn't before.
What's the public reaction to some of these protests? Like, I'm sure you get some negative reactions, but do you also get some positive reaction, or do people reach out after the protest?
Yeah, we get a mix of both. We definitely get our negative reactions, especially if there's an article about it, and you have to have a thick skin to read those comments. But we get a lot of very positive reactions. I think we often get people who want to join, who ask for our contact info, or most often we find those people either over Facebook. They've seen a video on Facebook that inspired them, or they saw a video in the news that inspired them. We also, one of my favorite things is seeing the conversations we trigger among people who are shopping. And often they don't start out or necessarily occur in a particularly favorable way, but you see that they're having to deal with this issue. And my favorite thing to see is children who witness our protests and ask their parents what's going on. Because you see the parents they want to sort of brush it off and say, oh, just ignore these people, whatever. But the children keep asking because the children don't buy that. They don't think that people march into a grocery store and start speaking out against what's going on when there's no big deal. And so the children really force their parents to have this really uncomfortable conversation. And I think those conversations are where these walls begin to crumble. A child who sees their parent give this really waffling response, they might not be able to change now, but years down the road, they're going to realize, like, wow, my mom, my dad couldn't explain this. There's no reason for this. And I'd say the other crucial thing, and really I think the two primary goals of our protests are, one, to energize activists and to create activists. And so it may seem sort of silly and unnecessary to do these sorts of protests for the purpose of creating activists, but I think that going into one of these stores or restaurants and delivering a speak out, especially with a group of supportive people, can really change you in a profound way. That sense of sort of speaking truth to justice can really change who you are. And I've seen in the past year, I have affected my friends and my family far more profoundly than I ever did before. I was vegan for, as I said, 4 years before becoming an activist. And there really weren't many people who ever changed their diet or really changed their beliefs. But now that I've become an activist, I have my parents are still a word I wish could be banished from the English language. They're pescatarian, unfortunately, but they stopped eating birds after seeing videos of our investigations. I have a good high school friend who has stopped eating animals after talking to me. He tells me, you made me go vegetarian because you just wouldn't shut up about it. And I have someone I know from college who I didn't know particularly well, but I saw him recently and he came up to me and he said, I want to credit you. I've stopped eating animals and I'm probably going vegan because he'd seen my videos on Facebook. And based on the number of comments I've gotten just over Facebook, I'm sure there are people who I've affected who I have not heard about. And none of this happened before I got involved in this work. So I think it can really change who you are as a person and create activists who can change those around them. And there's actually, to get back to my interest in social science, there's a lot of social science suggesting that this is how protests often work. There's a recent study of the Tea Party done by a number of prominent economists. And what they found was that Tea Party protesters had a profound effect. Each additional protester really increased the chance of a Republican winning the election. They increased the conservatism of incumbents' voting records and of the newly elected members of Congress's voting records. And the mechanism that it seemed led to this effect was that protesters would go home and would talk to their friends and talk to their family and would change their opinions. So I think the protests that we organize lead to many conversations in our activists' circles. And then the second thing is it's really a demonstration of strength and of the social power of this movement and of the strength of these demands for violence against animals to stop. So we are not trying to sort of create incremental improvements. We want to change the system profoundly. But I think it is a sign of the strength of our protests that after the first investigation, Whole Foods announced these new egg laying standards. And I think it's a sign of our more recent investigation that you saw Whole Foods being put on the risk list in the Wall Street Journal. And so, those are just two examples. But I think especially as it starts to build more and more, you're going to see that whether people like us or not, they have to listen to us because we have a demand that has to be met.
How do you respond to the internal AR criticisms of some of the tactics that DXE uses?
So there are a number of criticisms. I would respond differently to different criticisms. I think one is that it's not an effective way of getting people to go vegan, and I think that what I just laid out is sort of my answer to that, which is that the goal of our protest is not to get people in those stores and restaurants to immediately go vegan. It's to A, energize activists to change their friends and family members, and B, to create that social power. So I would say I'm not convinced it doesn't help people go vegan. I would say a lot of the people criticizing us offer as alternatives things like leafleting, things like Facebook ads, and they claim that these are evidence-backed. But a lot of the evidence behind leafleting and other strategies and other tactics, I can say based on my experience working in social science and behavioral economics, this evidence is extremely, extremely weak and often completely misinterpreted. So there's a study a few years ago, and there was again a more recent study on the impacts of leafleting. The study a few years ago intended to do what we do where I work, which is a randomized evaluation where you randomly give some people one type of leaflet about animal agriculture, and then some people randomly got a control leaflet. And so you could see whether the people who got one leaflet were more likely to be vegan than the others. Well, so what happened was they couldn't find anyone who got the control leaflets. And so they, after the fact, decided to have as the control group people who just reported not getting a leaflet. Now, there are all sorts of issues. I cannot get to all the issues with this, but one basic issue is that people are more likely to remember a leaflet if they were affected by it. So you could just have that the people who were affected by a leaflet remember it, and the people who were not affected by it forget. And so you're going to see an effect of a leaflet when, in fact, there isn't any such effect. There are many more issues, but at a very basic level, you're not comparing apples to apples. You're not getting a sense of the difference between someone who gets a leaflet and someone who doesn't get a leaflet. But a lot of people have recognized that this evidence is shaky, but they'll still use it. At the Animal Rights Conference, I heard people throwing out the statistics that come from this study and acting like they were sound science. More recently, there was a study where they said they found that some leaflets were more likely to make people go vegetarian than other leaflets, but they sort of buried in the middle of a longer paper another very strange result that suggests significant methodological issues with this study, which was that people who got leaflets at all were less likely to reduce their meat consumption, go vegetarian, go vegan, than people who didn't get a leaflet at all, which just to me seems completely implausible. So the evidence for these other tactics is also very weak. And another thing that I think is very problematic in criticism of DXE is that people base their criticisms often on the stated opinion of people watching our protests or of people they talk to. So they say, people watching our protests say we look ridiculous. They say they hate us. They say it's not convincing. And this is similar to some of the evidence for alternative tactics. People will say, well, when I ask people, they say that they're more likely to be influenced by an argument for environmental reasons than an argument for animal rights reasons. And the bottom line is these self-reports are really often a poor guide to what's working, and it cannot not even a poor guide, but can also point you in the exact wrong direction. So as an example, we don't like to have our beliefs challenged. I mean, it's not fun to have someone come in and tell you you're wrong. So if someone's telling you that, you're probably not going to say, oh, I think they're awesome. I really like them. And so I think we should take that with a really big grain of salt. And then as a second thing, these self-reports are often just indicative of what social pressure has led us to believe. So if I'm raised in a society where no one takes animal rights seriously, where it's sort of laughed at, an argument from an animal rights perspective, for taking animal rights seriously, I'm not going to respond well to. I'm not going to say, oh, I believe this argument. But the only way to get that idea accepted and to get people to accept that idea is to keep pushing it and to offer that counter pressure to the social pressure that's making them reject it. And so when we look at these surveys and when we look at people's opinions, we come away with this sort of static image of where things are and the sense of, oh, you have to do this to appeal to people. But it's not about appealing to people where they are now. It's about changing the background. It's about changing the context in which people are thinking, in which people are making decisions. And then I would just say in response that while I think the evidence on this sort of psychological level that people are using to criticize us and offer alternative tactics is pretty weak, what got me involved in this is that I think relative to the weakness of that evidence, there is a pretty strong consensus, and I think it's just pretty clear looking at history that nonviolent protest movements have been extremely vital to changing all sorts of norms, whether it's the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. Protests work, and we do not have a movement of people who are able to mobilize quickly and in large numbers for animal rights in this country. And I think building that movement is the most vital thing we can do.
Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with us. Is there a way that people can get in touch with you or the work that you do?
Yeah, definitely. You can email me. My email is Zach, Z-A-C-H, at directactioneverywhere.com.
Well, we end every episode saying fuck, shit, damn. Would you mind saying it for us this week?
Fuck, shit, damn.
This week you heard
Red Eye by the album Leaf.
Right now you're listening to
Fanshawe by L1011.
You know those two bands? You can go to the show notes and click on them and buy the music on iTunes. And while you're in iTunes, rate and review the podcast.
Yeah, it really helps us out. And if you don't rate and review, it hurts us.
It makes us bleed from your lack of words.
I mean, it definitely bleeds us down to the bottom of the list when people search for the show.
It bleeds us down to the bottom of the list?
Yes, your inaction bleeds us down to the bottom of the list.
I'm going to go with that. So please help stop the bleeding and write a review for us.
All you need to do to put a bandage on it is... All you need to do to put a bandage on it is click...
Write a review.
That's right. Give us a little fiver, a little 5-star.
A little fiver.
A little 5-star will fix that bleeding right up.
And when you're done with that, head over to our social media sites that we have.
Help boost our egos by writing us a little friendly thing. Say hi. We'll say hi back. We're really nice. We respond to everybody. I don't know why more people don't write us. Maybe they just don't like us. It's fair.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what to say.
That's it. Just go to whichsidepodcast.com, click on the social tab, be our friend, like us, follow us, be one of us. If you want to be a member of the Which Side and get exclusive content that we don't have for normal listeners, and also get some pretty awesome swag, like shirts and bandanas, and free shout outs and discounts to the Which Side Collective store, You can do that by being a member of the show. Just go to whichsidepodcast.com again. You're already there. Click on the members. Yeah.
Fuck shit, damn.
Fuck shit, damn.
Which Side Podcast is hosted and produced by Jordan Halliday and Jeremy Parkin of the Which Side Media Collective, with web design by Jordan Halliday and sound design by Jeremy Parkin. Booking by Mari Halliday. Theme music by Commandantes. Go to whichsidecollective.org to check out the other shows in the collective. As always, fuck shit damn.